Welcome, everyone. You're tuned in to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Be sure to hit the like button as you come on. This is the last live stream of the year, and what a year has been. We have seen everything from a year's worth of genocide in Gaza to an all-out regional war breaking out in West Asia, and of course, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which has seen Russia seize the initiative. All of that has come with so many developments and issues and power struggles and geopolitical shockwaves that we have to talk about today. And so, as you hit the like button, I'm going to introduce my guest. It is the one and only Scott Ritter. Scott is a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and a former UN weapons inspector. You can follow his work in the video description below. Hey, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, thanks. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year tomorrow.
Same to you. Same to you. Well, let's get started then. We have just one day left of this year and of 2024. And I wanted to start out with the conflict in Ukraine because the conflict has changed dramatically over the past year. We've seen now Russia reject Donald Trump's peace proposal. And this in and of itself seems to mark a huge shift in this conflict. So I wanted to ask you, given all that we are seeing right now, we're hearing U.S. officials talk about Kursk collapsing for Ukraine within months. They've already lost more than at least half of what they've gained. Talk about what are the biggest shockwaves for you, the biggest developments for you, Scott, with this conflict over the year, and how does it inform the present situation?
Well, I mean, what we've seen is consistency in the Russian approach here. The Russians have made it the goal and their objective, the physical destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. This has been frustrating to analysts such as myself who are used to seeing arrows advance on a map. But the Russians have decided that it's far better to do the work up front and destroy the military than it is to carry out very expensive offensive operations that seize territory but at great cost, and allow the enemy a chance to withdraw, regroup, and then force you to do it all over again. The Russians have, over the course of the last year, carried out a brutally efficient offensive operation with singular focus on killing as many Ukrainians as possible, and they've been tragically very effective at it. And I say tragically because even though I view Russia being on the right side of history, and I view the Ukrainian regime as, possessing an ideology that is odious, linked to Stepan Bandera. Human life is human life, and there are, by some estimates now, over 1 million Ukrainians dead or permanently injured because of this conflict. And that's because of the absolute lethality of the Russians. That doesn't mean that the Ukrainians aren't putting up a fight. The Russians have taken serious casualties themselves. I don't know if it was a misspoke or the Russians just decided to come out and say it, but I think the mayor of Moscow spoke of rehabilitation centers in and around Moscow that have rehabilitated 600,000 Russian wounded. That's a number that's greater than I had assessed. But it, again, I don't know he said it, so we have to wonder if maybe that's the case, and which means Russia has taken greater casualties. I think wounded is so. I think the Russian dead aren't that much, because the way the battle's being fought lately, forget all the propaganda you read. The Russians aren't carrying out human wave assaults and suicidal attacks. There are probes that are made by platoon and company sized forces that sometimes get thrown back, and thrown back with violence. But those aren't human wave attacks. Generally speaking, the Russians seek to combine superior intelligence with superior firepower and command and control, and they very bit by bit just go in there and take out this bunker, that bunker. If you've watched the battles, the videotapes where the commander is literally telling the soldiers on the ground, he's in the trench next to you, to your left, come to the trench to your left, shoot to your left, advance. And you do this, and I've talked to some commanders and some journalists on the ground, and they say there's days that go by without a single Russian death in some of the major fighting where they're advancing. There are wounded. The Ukrainians are very effective at flooding the zone with drones, and the drones have proven to be perhaps the greatest impediment to even swifter Russian advances. But this has been a bloody, grinding war that now has reached the phase where Russia has worn the Ukrainian armed forces down to the point where they're starting to get the bigger advances. And we're seeing this measured in kilometers per day, not tens of meters or hundreds of meters. And as the situation unfolds every day, the Ukrainians are put in a worse position. They don't have troops to man the totality of the front, and I just think we're going to see the Russians, start an even bigger push as the Ukrainians lose the kind of cohesion necessary to maintain a constant, line of defense along the totality of the line of contact. And this is something that, I've been predicting this for some time now, ever since the Russians got into the war of attrition. I think I was far too optimistic about how quickly Russia would be able to achieve, this transition, the correlation of forces that would lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian armed force. It was inevitable. It was going to happen. The question is, why did it take this long? And I think the answers are the Ukrainians are just a hell of a lot better at fighting than I had given them credit for. I mean, even the Russians that I talked to, and I tried to explain this, they said, well, we want them to surrender, but they don't. They fight to the death. And we have to go in, and we literally have to pull them out or kill them or bury them in every basement, one building at a time. And it just takes a long time to do this. And the other surprise has been the drones. The drones have been very effective. The Ukrainians have also improved their artillery. The ammunition promised by the West is starting to arrive on the front lines, and so the Ukrainians are able to bring to bear artillery that forces the Russians to be cautious. The last thing you want to do when the enemy has the ability to reach out and touch you is to give them targets, and so the Russians aren't going to mass their troops for a big breakout effort, only to find themselves covered by Ukrainian artillery directed by Ukrainian drones, and you lose a lot of equipment. So again, the Ukrainians have capabilities that cause the Russians to pause and slowly use their advantages to wear down the enemy and then make your advance. And the Ukrainians are just running out of troops, running out of equipment. And as I said, eventually we're going to reach the point of collapse. And I believe that's going to take place. Here I go. I believe it's going to take place in the first half of 2025. So do a lot of other people. But, the Ukrainians have surprised everybody by their resilience. They're not going to win. It's not as though the Ukrainians are, holding on or able to come back with a knockout punch. But they will drag this thing out as long as they have bodies to sacrifice. And one of the tragedies is the Ukrainians are considering signing into law conscription, law that allows them to go down to 18 years old. And you're basically taking teenagers and putting them to combat. Now, we do that in the American military. I enlisted in the Army when I was 17. But the difference is I got trained and full training, not half-ass training. these 18-year-olds are going to be given very poor training, and then they're going to be thrown into a deteriorating situation on the front where they don't have the kind of experienced people left who are able to provide, the backbone of a unit and, that serve as their mentors. They're going to be thrown out there. And if you listen to the debriefings of these Ukrainian prisoners of war, they're thrown in without a plan, without support. They're just, put into a trench and told to hold, and then they don't hear from their commander. And next thing you know, the Russians are there and they have a choice to surrender or die. And the ones who, most of these newly mobilized people opt for surrendering. The more experienced Ukrainian soldiers, they opt to die, and that's what makes this thing hard. But I think we're looking at, the collapse of the Ukrainian ability to maintain. And the question is, what does Russia do with that? And I think, we don't have an answer for that right now. We know that the Russians have committed to recovering the totality of Kherson. That includes the right bank, Zaporizhia, all of it. All of Donetsk, and they already have most, if not all, of Lugansk. Those are the four territories that were subjected to a referendum, a controversial referendum, but a referendum nonetheless in September of 2022. They voted to be absorbed into Russia, and they have been, and by law, by constitution, this is Mother Russia. And the Russians have said, it's ours. The war doesn't stop until we get it. Now, the question is, what does Russia do after that? And here's where there's some controversy. You've heard Medvedev, you've heard Putin, you've heard others allude to the possibility of Russia, moving on and taking Odessa, Kharkov, maybe Dnipropetrovsk, and Nikolaev. Sumy is now on the table because the Ukrainians were dumb enough to launch this offensive into Kursk from the Sumy province. But Putin hasn't made this a publicly announced objective. And so I do believe that if a good plan was put on the table, that this could be preserved. And I interviewed a Ukrainian prime minister, former Ukrainian prime minister, who's now part of the government in exile in Russia. And I asked him about the future of Odessa and Kharkov, because there's a school of thought that I adhere to that if Odessa and Kharkov are stripped away from Ukraine, it kills Ukraine economically, the future of Ukraine. And that's not necessarily the goal of Russia. And so his belief, and this is a former Ukrainian prime minister, is that Odessa and Kharkov remain with Ukraine, but the post-conflict Ukraine will be politically aligned with Russia. They'll call it neutral, but it won't be neutral. It'll be politically aligned with Russia, with an economic and political union with Russia, similar to that which exists with Belarus. But it'll have zero ties to Nato, zero ties to the West. And if that's the case, if that's the outcome that's achieved, then I think Odessa and Kharkov can stay with Ukraine. But Trump he floated his grossly irresponsible plan. I mean, everybody who we never saw the formal plan, but heard whispers of it. Everybody who heard a whisper of it said that's just not going to work. Russia will never. That's basically telling Russia, you lost. And Russia's saying, no, we won. We're winning, and we're going to win, and we're going to get everything we want out of this war, everything. And Trump needs to understand that. And I think this is a setback. Now the question is, what does Trump do? And hopefully he's being advised that they don't have any options. That eventually they're going to have to give the Russians what the Russians want. The sooner they give it, the better off Ukraine will be. Even though Ukraine won't be in the Western orbit, you'll have a Ukraine that has economic viability because they retained some territorial integrity. But if Trump decides to play stupid games, talk about reinforcing Ukrainians and getting NATO to spend more money, then Russia will just continue to do what it does until they've retaken all the territory they said they were going to take, and then they'll just move on and take more territory. And then in the end, we can see the total destruction of Ukraine. So we're at one of those pivot points right now where, there's some political decisions that have to be made. But one thing is certain, that militarily Russia has won this conflict and will continue to be winning this conflict. They're not going to yield back to the West anything that they've accomplished here. There will be no peacekeepers. I always tell people, well, what about peacekeepers? I said, well, do you know what a peacekeeper is? Peacekeeper is when two sides fight each other to a stalemate and they agree to a ceasefire. And the peacekeeper's job is to go in between them and keep the two warring parties apart. Why would Russia want that to happen when Russia's winning? There's no stalemate here. There's no frozen battlefield. Russia is advancing everywhere. And Russia will never say, yeah, we're just going to stop. We're going to give up all of our advantages. Because the moment, people also need to understand this, the collapse of the Ukrainian military is happening because of things that happen on the margin. It's not that the whole military suddenly collapses. It's that they're no longer able to maintain the kind of combat capacity along the entire front. And so gaps emerge, and those gaps get exploited, and then they create compound problems, and the Ukrainians have to pull back. The moment, and the key thing is to keep the Ukrainians unable to reinforce, unable to reorganize, totally off balance. And you do that by keeping the pressure forward, which is what the Russians are doing. The moment you have a ceasefire, all that pressure ceases. And the Ukrainians now will be able to come in and rapidly fill in the margins and create. It won't take long for the Ukrainians to actually reestablish cohesion on the front line. Why would Russia ever allow that to happen? Russia has had a strategy since, the rejection of the Istanbul Accords, Istanbul Communique, I think it was back in April, May. I think in May of 2022, Russia said we're going into the next phase, which is, to recapture the Donbass. And at that point in time, it was a war of attrition. And basically, every time NATO and the United States poured in another $40 billion or so of material, Russia just adjusted and kept going in and grinding it down. And it took a long time. But Russia's never surrendered the advantages it's had, and it's always maintained this pressure. And now we're coming up to year 3, and why would Russia surrender this after all the sacrifices they've made, after everything that's been done to get them to this point? Why would Russia give any of it away? And the answer is they're not going to. And the sooner the United States realize it, because really, America is the only vote that counts other than Putin. NATO's broke. Trump can talk about increasing defense spending from 2% to 5%. They don't have the ability to do that. Some of the smaller nations could do it for a short period of time, but the big nations can't. Germany definitely can't. France can't. And without that kind of expenditure, which over years necessary to rebuild a NATO military capacity, NATO doesn't have anything it can bring to the table. It has to have the United States, and Trump isn't going to do this. So the sooner Trump realizes that he literally has no cards, he's been dealt, he doesn't even have a pair of twos. He's got nothing. And he's already peeked into Putin's hand, and he saw 3 aces. And he can just assume maybe there's a 4th one out there. You're not going to beat the Russians on this one. So the sooner Putin or Trump realizes this, the sooner the United States can come in and be an effective leader in the West and tell NATO, no, we're done. Ukraine, it's over, and we're cutting our losses, and we're going to try and consolidate with what we have left. But Ukraine's a lost cause, and Russia wins because Russia has won.
I wanted to ask you, Scott, about, Sergei Lavrov recently came out and said straight up that this idea that Ukraine will have some kind of pause from NATO membership of 20 years, I believe, in this plan alone is reason to reject it. Comment on that.
Well, I mean, that's what I think Putin also said something about this. He said initially they wanted 10 years to get Ukraine. They said Ukraine's not ready for NATO membership, and they were looking for 10 years. And Putin said, well, 10 years to do what? Get them ready? Well, what does that mean? To turn them into NATO. And we're not going to let that happen. So the same concept is, 20 years. 20 years to do what? get them ready to be a member of NATO. And Russia, that's an outcome that Russia will never allow. I mean, that I don't know why the West can't understand it, that this is an existential question for Russia, one which they are literally ready and willing to fight to the death about. And, you know, for Europe, this isn't an existential issue. I know we have some warmongers in NATO that try to make it seem like it, but Europe's not going to fight and die for Ukraine. The United States certainly isn't going to fight and die for Ukraine. Russia will fight and die to keep Ukraine from becoming part of NATO. And so there will be no 20-year pause, 50-year pause, because eventually those calendars run out. It was only 10 years ago that, that the Maidan took place, and Viktor Yanukovych was ousted and the new Ukrainian nationalist government, came into power. Years fly by, and eventually you get to 20, and then you're going to have to do this all over again. So Russia has sacrificed too much. They're going to solve this problem now, and that problem will be solved by a permanent treaty, and it will be a treaty that says Ukraine will never be a member of NATO, ever.
Scott, a good chunk of 2024 in this conflict has been spent in Kursk, where Ukraine attempted to, and successfully for a time, quote unquote, took Russian territory in this region. Now, though, they're talking, the United States and NATO, unnamed officials are talking about in 2025, within the first few months, this could all be reversed. All of Ukraine's gains could be reversed. What's happening here?
Well, I think it was in August that Ukraine launched this offensive into Kursk, and apparently it took the Russians by surprise. I know there's conspiracy theorists out there who say this was a trap set by Russia. I've spoken to some pretty senior Russian commanders who said, no, this wasn't a trap. We were caught sleeping. The bottom line is Ukraine took their strategic reserve, which Russia was very worried about. I mean, at that time, you were talking 20, 30,000 fully organized, equipped, trained, veteran combat formations. And, as Russia was beginning to, start this relentless advance, the Russians were always worried about where the reserves will be committed. And Russia had to be careful. Another reason why Russia had to be slow, because every advance, extends you. And what you need to do once you advance, you have to stop the advance and you have to bring forces up. And so otherwise you create potential, weak points in your lines. And if the Ukrainians came in with a counterattacking force, there could be problems. And 20 to 30,000 is a strong force. The Ukrainians launched their 2023 summer offensive with a similar number of troops. So you can't be dismissive of this. This is 20 to 30,000 highly trained, well equipped. This is where the M1 Abrams, this is where the Challenger tanks were, this is where the Leopard 2s were. All the modern equipment was in these formations. And so the Russians were just waiting for that. And that really impacted their ability to be even more aggressive, because you can't be too aggressive when you got this knockout punch just waiting right there. You can't let them land that punch, and you have to be prepared when they throw it that you can, slip it and then counter punch and take care of it. So that's what the Russians were doing. Suddenly they go into Kursk, and Russia wasn't ready for it, politically or militarily. I think the goal of going into Kursk was to seize a lot of territory that could be used as a negotiating chip, any future peace talks. Basically say, we've got your territory, we'll give it back, but you've got to give back, some of ours. And, it's an impossible situation for Russia, because Russia will never give up Russian territory. And the four oblasts that have been absorbed are, from the Russian perspective, Mother Russia. The other thing is Kursk is holy ground. I mean, we're talking about, this is the land where the big 1943 battle was fought, sacred ground for the Russians. But the Ukrainians went in there, made some significant advances. Then the Russians didn't do what the Ukrainians wanted them to do. The Ukrainians were hoping that the Russians would move 100,000 troops away from the Donbass fight and, to come in and seal off this attack. And that would slow down the Donbass fight, getting the equivalent of a freeze or a ceasefire, because now the Russians are advanced, giving the Ukrainians a chance to, start to knit things back together. And that's what they wanted. They wanted a pause in the advance. The Russians didn't pause at all. They kept going. They sent a Marine Brigade, an Airborne Brigade, and Akhmat Special Forces up to the area to do a screen to contain the Ukrainians. And then they've just been slowly and relentlessly grinding back. They brought in more forces, but they never diverted forces away from the main effort. And this is why this has been a strategic defeat for the Ukrainians, because they didn't achieve their objectives. What they did do is not only have the strategic reserves completely destroyed, but the additional forces that are in the pipeline being trained are coming in. These are, again, well-trained, physically fit guys who, were supposed to take that 20 to 30 and turn it into 50 or 60,000 strong strike force. They're now getting fed into the Kursk fighting, and they're being slaughtered. I think the Russians have said over 50,000 now have perished, and along with some of the best equipment that the Ukrainians had. Meanwhile, in the Donbass, there's no troops to film the front line. There was a interesting film clip on Telegram on one of the channels that showed a car going through a Ukrainian checkpoint, military checkpoint that's about 10 kilometers removed from the battlefield. There's nobody in the checkpoint. Normally it's, fully manned with a, maybe a company or a battalion-sized force, totally empty, because the Ukrainians don't have any manpower left, because they're all dead and dying or stuck in Kursk, and they're running out of guys on the front line. So Kursk is a huge strategic defeat for the Ukrainians. It was politically embarrassing for Putin, but he got by it. He doesn't operate in the same political dynamic that we have here in the West, being embarrassed, by the Ukrainians. It's water off a duck's back. He just stayed on mission, and now he's turned what was an embarrassing setback for the Russians into a strategic victory, because they used to be worried about what was going to happen to that strategic reserve. They don't have to worry about that anymore. They've destroyed it, and what's left is in Kursk, and they ain't coming out of Kursk except in a body bag or prisoners. And that's it. I think you're going to see the Kursk salient be reduced, and I think you're going to see the Russians maybe even begin to advance into Sumy, because one of the things the Russians have said is that even if they don't acquire this territory outright, there will be a significant demilitarized zone separating what's left of Ukraine and Russia proper. And I think Russia will advance to the point where they want that buffer to be. And then, at the end of the conflict, there will be discussions about, what forces will be in there. They won't be Western forces. They won't be foreign forces. They'll probably be reconstituted Ukrainian forces, or maybe Belarusian forces or something that will, patrol that as the Russians, pull back to whatever boundary they end up being at. But that's where we're at right now. The Ukrainian army's just run out of manpower. That's its biggest problem right now, is they just don't have anybody left to fight.
Yeah, during this year, Scott, we saw too the intense escalation that brought many to believe that a World War III like scenario would break out, even nuclear conflict, because of the U.S. and NATO's approval of long-range missile strikes into Russia. Now, the latest report as of the very last days of 2024 is that Ukraine is essentially out of these missiles, that they started with 500. Now they have 50. And I'm wondering if you could comment on just how significant this move was by the United States and by NATO, and how did this end up happening? How did it end up happening where this is seemingly a disaster, maybe an embarrassing disaster, where these weapons were given to Ukraine and certainly not doesn't seem like much impact has been made from them.
Well, first of all, let's talk a bit why the Russians are so concerned about this weapon. If you look at a map of Ukraine, or where it is, let's go back to the old Soviet Union during the Cold War. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, so you've got. I'm trying to draw on with the camera here, but you got Ukraine's over here. It's part of the Soviet Union, so all the NATO forces are over here. Now, if you have an ATACMS missile or something of that nature, it's being launched from here. In order to hit Russia's strategic depth, which is here, which is outside of Ukraine in the central part of Russia, in the near the Rostov-on-Don and other of the oblasts, the Ukrainians can. I mean, the NATO would have to fire a missile from NATO territory. It would have to fly all the way across Ukraine to get to the strategic depth. The Americans pointed this out to the United States and NATO in December of 2021, January 22, saying, hey, whatever we come up with, you can't have missiles in Ukraine. We can't allow it. And Tony Blinken basically blew them off and said, nah, we don't care. The ATACMS is a battlefield artillery system, but it has the ability to fly 300 kilometers. Now, normally you'd say, well, okay, that's 300 kilometers, not a big deal. But again, if the missile was launched here from the old NATO borders, 300 kilometers would put it somewhere in Ukraine. But now that you've moved it to Ukraine all the way up to the border, when it launches now, it has the ability to strike the Russian strategic depth. And now that tactical missile takes on operational and strategic capabilities in terms of the impact it can have, taking out command and control, logistics, etc., hitting targets that they never would have been able to hit had Ukraine not been turned into a NATO, springboard for NATO military activity. So this is why Russia has said not only will Ukraine never be part of NATO, but there can never be Western missiles in Ukraine because of the fact that when you bring them into Ukraine, you literally expose the soft underbelly of Russia's, strategic center. And Russia can't allow that to happen. And this is why the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow and the Scalp have become such important weapons, because normally they're not strategic weapons, but now they have strategic importance. And Russia has said that these weapons can't be used. The Biden administration, for a while, agreed that they couldn't be used to strike Russia proper. But after the Biden administration lost, after the Democrats lost the election in November, I guess the mindset in the Biden administration changed from, trying to avoid escalation, knowing that we'll be able to continue this policy of promoting the proxy war against Russia for at least 4 more years of a Kamala Harris presidency. Now it is, how do they tie Trump's hands? How do they create the worst possible situation so that Trump can't come in and just withdraw and undo everything that they've done? And so they gave the Ukrainians permission to fire these missiles in a manner which threatens Russia's strategic depth. And this is something the Russians have said, look, we're willing to go to nuclear war on this. You can't fire these things into our soft underbelly. We're not going to give you that right to, you can't do it. This isn't about the war in Ukraine. It's about, our survival as a nation state. And when they allowed this to happen, and I think around November 20th is when 19th or 20th is when the United States gave Ukraine permission to fire these. The Russians responded by firing a weapon that had never been fired in combat before, which is an intermediate range weapon system known as the arent. They fired it and struck a factory, sending a signal that this is what Russia means by no, you can't fire these missiles or else there will be strategic response. This one was non-nuclear, but today Russia just announced that it's lifted the moratorium on the deployment of intermediate and short range ballistic missiles, strategic missiles that have nuclear warheads. So what that means is the arent now has nuclear payload. The arents are being deployed have nuclear payloads in addition to this unconventional, this conventional warhead that they used against the Yuzhmash facility in Dnipropetrovsk. It's a very dangerous situation. We are literally one stupid mistake away from the potential for a nuclear war. And people need to understand how close we've come to this on several occasions. The Russians only have so many escalatory steps left. They've already, taken this to a very dangerous place by using a strategic system in combat. They may have, one or two more escalatory, movements they can make using the conventionally armed Oreshnik. But if, there's 50 ATACMS left in the Ukrainian inventory. If those missiles went out and struck a strategic command and control center that was related to Russia's nuclear deterrence and degraded that, Russia has to view that as an attack, preemptive attack on its nuclear infrastructure and respond accordingly, which will be a full nuclear exchange. This is where we're at. It's a very dangerous situation, and I don't think the Trump administration appreciates how much danger exists right now. Because there's some talk that they may go and strip even more. Trump has made a statement that says he's against the use of the ATACMS, but if now that Russia's rejected his peace terms, that may cause him to change his mind. So we'll see. It's a very, very dangerous situation that we face right now because Russia has lowered its threshold doctrinally for the use of nuclear weapons. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I walked the halls of Congress back in November in an effort to meet with representatives so that they could implement policies that prohibited the use of the ATACMS missiles to strike Russian territory. I had a very interesting meeting with a senior representative who, at that time, the media was reporting that the CIA had done an assessment that said that the Russians are bluffing, that Russia will not go nuclear because of the use of ATACMS missiles. And I wanted to impart on the representatives that that Russia isn't bluffing, that this is a very dangerous situation, and that if we're acting as if Russia is bluffing, we could end up finding ourselves in a full-scale nuclear war before we know it. And he said, Scott, I've received that briefing, the one you're talking about. And the CIA didn't say that Russia's bluffing. The CIA said that Russia's not bluffing, that if we continue to do this, that Russia would use its nuclear weapons. He said, that's frightening, but the scary part is what the White House said. That's okay. We're ready for this. We're ready to have a limited nuclear war with Russia. And you have Thomas Buchanan, the J6 planning officer, the guy who writes the nuclear war plans for Strategic Command, giving a presentation at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., I think on November 20th, where he said that the Biden administration is ready to have a nuclear exchange with Russia. And they're preparing to win this. The moment you start thinking, you can remember before the special military operation began in early 2022, all 5 nuclear armed permanent members of the Security Council came together and reiterated a statement that's been in place since the 80s, that nuclear wars cannot be won, therefore they should never be fought. And everybody said, we agree with that. Well, the United States right now is saying, well, we're ready to have a nuclear war that we're going to win, which means we were either lying when we made that statement or we're somehow making new policy as we go along. But the fact of the matter is we are prepared to go to nuclear war right now. We're the problem, not the solution. And Trump, needs to understand that, the United States has put a policy in place under the Biden administration in the last 2 months of the administration's tenure in office that accepts the possibility or even probability of nuclear war with Russia as a desired outcome. Um, this should scare the hell out of everybody because it's literally what's happening. I'm not making this up. Go to the website of the Center for Strategic International Studies. Go to Rear Admiral Thomas Buchanan's keynote address. It's sort of a boring address, doesn't say too much. Go to the question and answer period and start on about question 2, where he says they're ready to have a nuclear war. I think either in that question or the answer to the third one, where he says, yeah, you know, the problem is we haven't been really honest with the American people about what this means. Even if we win, what does winning look like? And he said that what winning looks like is that life for America will never be the same. In short, I'll just tell you what the answer is. We'll become a military dictatorship where we'll have martial law imposed because the normal infrastructure that keeps the society moving will be done. There won't be free interstate commerce. Food supplies are going to be, very much at risk. Food will be rationed. There will be no freedoms. All you gun owner guys, forget about it. Your guns are gone. They'll be taken from you. There won't be freedom of speech. You won't be allowed to speak out because we'll be in a perpetual emergency situation. There won't be the internet. Electricity be rationed because there won't be power plants. This is winning a nuclear war. And he did say that maybe it's time the government be honest with the American people about what it is we're getting ready to do and what the consequence. Because if they were honest with us, do you think there's many Americans who go, "That's what we want. Yeah, let's do that"? I think every American would say, "Hell no," especially about Ukraine. And it's one thing if the Russians are coming across the border threatening to take America. Okay, you go down with the ship maybe, but for Ukraine, we're going to commit suicide for Ukraine. I mean, this is a very, very dangerous situation that we're at right now. And I'm a little concerned about how Trump's going to take having his peace plan. Remember, because how cocky he was. I can solve this with one phone call. I got this, baby. I'm Donald Trump. I'm the king of the world. We're going to make this thing happen. He just got bitch slapped. And excuse my language. But I mean, it's it. Bam. That just total get out of here. We're not considering any of it. It's all bad. How's he going to respond to that? Because Donald Trump doesn't respond well to this sort of rejection, but he's going to have to. He's going to have people who tell him, "Boss, we don't have any cards here. We literally have no cards. We have to give the Russians what they want." And the consequences for trying to provoke the Russians could be a nuclear war. And at least Trump is the one candidate on the campaign trail that said we can't have a nuclear war. He at least showed some understanding of what the consequences of this would be.
Yeah, and it's an interesting over this past year. This conversation about Ukraine has moved more and more into how to end the conflict, how to pause the conflict, and I think that shows a lot about where things have gone, where Russia has indeed seized the initiative. But there's still a lot of talk, Scott, about Russia bluffing, and you mentioned it on the nuclear question. But I wanted you to talk about these steps in the escalatory ladder, because when Russia did launch the Oreshnik, there was similar talk about Russia is just bluffing. This wasn't that significant, and it's likely not going to launch this again. Now, Russia has indeed taken a long pause before it launches this weapon again. But could you talk about what Russia could do entering 2025 should, as your analysis was there, should Trump and the Trump administration take the rejection not so kindly and continue upon their own escalatory ladder?
Well, there's two faces to Russia. There's the Dmitry Medvedev face. He is the rabid wolf, the bad cop, whatever you want to say. And he's just talking. He always articulates the extreme Russian positions. And then there's the reality of the Kremlin, the Putin Kremlin, which is a very, very steady, staid, pragmatic, realistic, voice that always shows patience, and it frustrates the heck out of people, especially in the West, analysts who, have taken a sympathetic line towards Russia, but they've, I think, allowed the fact that they see Russia being on the right side of history, meaning that they now have to, advocate for Russia. If you're an analyst, you can't advocate for anybody. You just got to report the facts. You're allowed to, if you believe it, to, emphasize the Russian facts over the Ukrainian facts. But you can't sit there and start cheerleading and then get disappointed when the Russian government doesn't do what you think the Russian government should have done. It's a trap I have to avoid all the time because, I'm somebody who believes that Russia's on the right side of history. I think Russia, is justified in doing what it's doing. I'm also somebody who wants to see this war come to an end as soon as possible. And so, sometimes I catch myself being, come on, Russia, you got to do more than that. Then I remind myself that Vladimir Putin couldn't give a damn what I think or anybody else in the West. We don't factor in. Putin has a plan. He knows what he wants to achieve. And the other thing is we observers in the West sometimes become so focused on the war, we forget about what Russia was trying to do to avoid the war and how that defines and shapes their national security strategy. In December 17th of 2021, Russia provided 2 draft treaties on how to de-escalate this push towards a conflict in Ukraine, one to NATO, one to the United States. And it spoke of the need for a new European security framework that respected Russia's legitimate right to a sphere of influence and sphere of interest, and the same thing with the West having one. But Russia believed that in order to achieve this, the West had to pull back, that NATO had to pull back its military infrastructure to pre-1997 lines, that is before the big eastward expansion. Russia said, look, this is what we're looking for here. We'd like you to read it, and then we're willing to talk about it, negotiate about it, but we're not going to wait forever. But you have to take it seriously. Neither NATO nor the United States took it seriously, and the end result is that Russia was compelled to initiate, the special military operation. But the war will end, and when it does end, I think Russia is going to be putting those very treaties back on the table, modified somewhat to better represent the present reality. But Russia, that's what Russia's looking for. Russia's looking for stability. They're not looking to invade NATO, to invade Poland, to invade anything. They weren't looking to go into Ukraine. They were willing to settle this thing, by a treaty. But I think, that's the strategic vision. And so, what is Putin going to do? He has got his military in a position right now where they're heading him in that direction, where they're going to have a decisive military victory, sufficient to bring credence to these draft treaties. But he has to get there. And what you don't want to do is stumble. And one of the ways you stumble is by doing something that legitimizes Western intervention, an overreaction, things of that nature. So I think what the Russians did, my understanding is, because even after the Oreshnik was fired, Ukraine fired a couple more missiles into Russia. So Russia called basically General Gerasimov, who's the chairman of the chief of staff of the Russian armed forces, called General Brown, who's the chairman, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they had a conversation. And my understanding is that one of the things that Gerasimov said is, look, we understand this is a conflict, etc. If Ukraine wants to fire ATACMS missiles, they can only fire them into a certain depth. They get beyond that depth, these become strategic attacks, and we will respond accordingly, to include nuclear weapons. And I think Gerasimov laid it out in plain. And I think Brown took it to heart. And yes, there have been more ATACMS, use of ATACMS missiles, but not against the long-range targets. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in the next 20 days, because the Biden administration has just greenlit and told Ukraine, use all 50 before Trump comes in, because once you get them, once Trump comes in, he'll probably tell you you can't fire them anymore. So now you're the Ukrainians, and if you just use them the way you're allowed to use them, you're not going to achieve something. They need to get that big provocation. They need to have NATO intervene. They need to have Russia overreact. So I think we're going to see Ukraine using long range strikes with these ATACMS missiles, and I think we're going to see Russia, if anything, respond with Oreshnik, but probably not. And the reason why I say that is they just rejected Donald Trump's initial overture, and for Trump, that's embarrassing, especially after what he said about one phone call. Do you really want to embarrass him more? There's only 50 ATACMS left. They're not going to do a knockout punch. I think Russia is going to absorb whatever Ukraine fires at them and continue to respond with the conventional capabilities, but they won't go to the Oreshnik anymore until Trump comes in. And then the question is what Trump does. And if Trump decides to play the escalation game, now the Russians will have the Oreshnik that can be used. But I think in the remaining time of the Biden administration, there's no reason for them to use Oreshnik, because their goal is to nothing the Ukrainians do with Storm Shadow, ATACMS, Scalp is going to change what's happening on the battlefield. It's going to cost Russia, resources, manpower. It's going to be embarrassing. But at the end of the day, the Russian army will continue to advance. The Ukrainian army will continue to collapse, and we're headed in the inevitable outcome. And that's Putin's objective. He needs to get to the point where he can put those draft treaties on the table, but not in a position where the West thinks, but we still have control over Ukraine. We're going to, transform Ukraine. But in a position where Russia says, we own Ukraine. Ukraine's not part of your equation anymore. So maybe you want to take a look at these treaties and see what how we can implement them. And I think that's the direction we're heading. So I think we're going to see a lot of patience from Vladimir Putin until Donald Trump becomes president. And then I think there's going to be about a six-month window where Russia will work with the United States to come up with a solution. But at the end of 6 months, if they're not, then Russia's just going to say, well, we're done talking. You're just delaying this thing. We're gonna administer the coup de grace. It's going to be interesting to see how the Trump administration does this. How do you negotiate? Normally, what you want is a good faith measure. You say, all right, we'll negotiate, but you need to agree to a ceasefire. And a ceasefire is something you agree to when you're getting sort of the snot kicked out of you, where you're saying, well, we got to stabilize our front. We have to buy time to resupply our people. And the Russians are like, well, we don't need to do that. We don't need to stabilize. So the Trump negotiating team's not going to have any of the traditional. Remember how we brought it into the Korean War, the last frozen conflict. The Chinese and the North Koreans would play games at the negotiating table, and we would launch a major offensive against Pork Chop Hill or some other hill. Send the Marines in to slaughter the Chinese and take another piece of territory. Of course, we'd lose a lot of guys too, but then the Chinese would be like, okay, we'll come and talk. Then when they hesitate again, we'd come in and hit them again. And very bloody fighting, but that's how we put leverage on the Chinese, is on the battlefield. Trump doesn't have any leverage to put on the Russians. The Ukrainians don't have the ability to bring pain to the Russians like the Russians can bring to Ukraine. So it's going to be a very interesting negotiation. This is why if the Trump administration would ever take my advice, it would be literally sit down with Putin and say, we're going to give you everything you asked for, but please let us pick the wrapping paper that we put on this gift. So it looks like at least we had some say in this. And I think the Russians will work with them so that there's some sort of face-saving mechanism, but not to the detriment of Russia's strategic objectives.
Right. And Scott, maybe lastly on the conflict, there's an unsung story, a story that isn't covered very often, isn't talked about very often, a consequence of what's been going on in Ukraine over now. We're in year 3. But this has apparently come to a head in Germany, where in December of 2024, the German government collapsed. Olaf Scholz lost a no confidence vote, and there's elections coming up in February 2025. Now, Bloomberg and many major economists worldwide, mainstream economists, are saying that there are chronic issues with Germany's economy. Unemployment is 6.1% and growing. And the overall situation is just really dire. Scott, how did this happen? How did Germany go from one of the most prosperous economies in Europe, the biggest economy in Europe, to now one of the most crisis-ridden?
Well, remember, Germany achieved its status, in its most recent status as the, the sort of the big boss of Europe under Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel ruled for a significant period of time. She had she was, a stable hand on the helm, and the German economy was doing well. But everything, what made the German economy tick was cheap Russian gas. That's the reality. You have this cheap Russian gas, you're able to afford, all the, heating luxuries, etc. But now you can run the furnaces without bankrupting yourself. All the money you save, you can put back into your social programs, retirement programs, it's vacations, workers' paradise kind of stuff. But Merkel, like all politicians, outlived her usefulness, and she was replaced by, Olaf Scholz, who cobbled together this coalition of green politicians and others who started to do things to Germany that undermined their economy even before the special military operation. The shutting down of nuclear power was a big initiative that research, shutting down coal plants, trying to transition into green power, wind power, etc. All of this was happening, and there was problems in the German economy adjusting to this. But again, as long as they had cheap Russian gas, they could still move forward. But the United States was against cheap Russian gas because we viewed that as a potential economic weapon for Russia that could be used to put pressure on Germany to do things, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, secretly, we wanted to be the supplier of energy to Europe for us to benefit economically, for us to have that leverage. We can't let the Russians have energy leverage over Europe. We need to have it. And then Germany, when the special military operation began in February, Germany signed on to not only sanctioning Russia, but to take the lead in, being the European lead in supporting Ukraine. And both of these turned out to be extraordinarily expensive and just bad for Germany. The sanctioning, blew back the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline by the United States. They haven't admitted it, but I think the consensus is the United States, if they didn't do it themselves, were directly involved in it. That cut down the gas. The United States now is selling gas to Germany at 3 to 5 times the amount that they would have paid. Things become prohibitive. The industry start to shut down. Ukraine, money is pouring in there. Meanwhile, in Germany, you have a Ukrainian refugee problem that's coming in that highlights an already, politically divisive, immigration issue with Middle East immigrants, North African immigrants flooding into Central Europe, including Germany, and creating, problems. And I think the combination of, a collapsing economy, this failed foreign policy that is, stripping money away from Germany to a Ukrainian cause that even the Germans themselves have trouble fully supporting. I mean, I think it was the fall of 2022, winter of 2022, The German military barracks where Ukrainians were being trained had to tell the Ukrainians, you can't post Nazi, you can't wear neo-Nazi symbols, you can't sing Nazi songs, you can't give Nazi salutes, you can't do it. You'll be sent home if you do this. This is the problem. I mean, people like to ignore this, but literally the Ukrainian military is composed of Nazis, people who support Stepan Bandera, sing songs of the glory of Stepan Bandera, and give Nazi salutes and wear Nazi symbology. So this was problematic for the Germans as well. But it was the economic collapse that was causing the biggest problems for Scholz. But I think the straw that broke the camel's back was the immigration. And in particular, I think all you need is one horrible event, and I think the car that drove through the Christmas market in Magdeburg was the straw that broke the camel's back. And the interesting thing is everybody expected Scholz's government to collapse, but they thought that I think the guy's name is either Werz, Werz, the head of the CPD, I don't know, Christian, maybe CDP, Christian Democratic Party. They thought he was going to be, and he's a hardcore anti-Russian, support the Ukraine conflict. And they said, he's going to be the next guy. After the Magdeburg incident, it's Alternative for Deutschland that's running, in the lead. And the interesting thing about Alternative for Deutschland is not only the policies they have towards the conflict in Ukraine, which is to unplug and get out and not do anything, not to support Ukraine in this. But they said, we're going to withdraw from the European Union as well. And if Germany withdraws from the European Union, that's the end of the European Union. And I think that this is sort of the situation we're seeing throughout all of Europe. We're starting to see, political issues of this magnitude. France, Macron's in a lot of trouble too. We had a collapse of the French government. He doesn't want to acknowledge that the parliament was won by, a majority of people who are opposed to what he's doing in Ukraine. So he continues to create minority governments ruled by prime ministers that, they can't rule because they don't have consensus support. And it just makes things even worse. There was a period of time a couple of weeks ago where Macron had to go on TV and challenge the French people and say, I will not resign. Stop asking for my resignation. I will see out my full term. But, you don't make those statements on TV unless you're under pressure to resign and you're feeling that pressure. And that's the truth about Macron. Let's look at Romania. Any talk about NATO troops going into Ukraine, the reality is that the springboard will be Romania, Romanian ports, Romanian airfields. Romania just elected a president who won the election, who said, I want to make it all zero. I want to zero this thing out. I don't want to have any involvement in Ukraine, and I don't want to have any involvement in NATO. Now, the intelligence services of Romania, at the behest of their Western masters, intervened into the courts and tried to make the case that the presidential election had to be nullified because of Russian interference. And the courts agreed. And so they nullified that. There will be a new election for the president. But now the newspapers have come back and said there was nothing there. The allegations of Russian interference, there was no evidence to sustain that. What we thought was Russian interference wasn't Russian interference. And the bottom line is this president-elect won the election fair and square. But nope, now they're buying time for a new election. They're going to try and beat him out. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that. But what happens to Romania when you have a president that says, we're done, we're finished, we're not doing this anymore? What happens, another example is Georgia. We've been trying to get a second front opened up against Russia and Georgia by, empowering, pro-Western elements of Georgian society who were receiving money from the United States, from Germany, from Europe to create these non-governmental organizations who were carrying out a soft power coup against the Georgian Dream Party. The ruling party has been ruling since 2012. The idea was, the feeling was that Georgia Dream was sympathetic to Russia, largely because of its founder, Bidzina Ivanishvili, is a Georgian billionaire who made his money in the Russian economy. And so the feeling was that he was beholden to Russia, etc. No, the fact of the matter is that Georgia Dream isn't a pro-Russian party; it's a pro-Georgian party, but it supports, very conservative values. It's not sympathetic to gays or transgendered at all, and it supports the church, etc. Sort of the exact opposite direction that the United States and Europe was trying to take Georgia in an effort to break the back of the conservative Georgian government, install a pro-West government that would instigate open a second front, ostensibly in the cause of, taking back Abkhazia, a breakaway province, taking back South Ossetia, another province. Both of them were stripped away from Georgia back in the early 1990s in, civil war. They were backed by the Russians, and many Georgians are bitter to Russia about this. They blame Russia for the loss of these. That's why it's sort of interesting that people say, well, these Georgians are, pro-Russian. Well, no, not really. They're not anti-Russian. They didn't go along with the sanctions, which is a point of bitterness in the United States. But while Europe's economy was falling apart, Georgia's economy was growing 10, 11, 12% per year. Why? Because they weren't involved in sanctions. They were engaged in normal economic intercourse with the Russians, and they were succeeding. Georgia doesn't want to be the enemy of Russia. Georgia would like to be a member of the European Union, but they don't want to be an enemy of Russia. But the United States and NATO wants Georgia to be an enemy of Russia. And so we've been in there, playing, trying to disrupt Georgian democracy. I bring this up because the European Union and NATO are supposed to be, the political and military arms of this European democracy that's operating in concert with the United States. But what we're seeing is that European democracy doesn't exist, that Europe has allowed itself to be hijacked by this European identity that isn't about democracy, it's about European hegemony. But it's not European hegemony, it's about being an extension of American hegemony, selling out everything Europe stands for the sole benefit of the United States. And this is the reality that Europe faces. I said when Mark Rutte, the current Secretary General of NATO, was appointed in the fall of this year, I think in October, he took over from Stoltenberg. I said Rutte will probably be the last Secretary General of NATO, because I don't think NATO survives another 5 years. I think we're seeing some fatal damage being done to NATO. And if Germany, the Scholz government has collapsed. If Alternative for Deutschland comes in, you're going to see them. They talked about withdrawing from the European Union. If Germany withdraws from the European Union collapses like a house of cards. As it goes, so goes NATO. Europe's in a huge crisis situation, and I think Trump would just as soon get the hell out of there and not get bogged down in that.
But Scott, how could you say that NATO is in a crisis situation when those who joined NATO not too long ago in 2023, Sweden and Finland, they're now getting graveyards? I don't know if you've seen this in Sweden. They are preparing land for additional graveyard space as they prepare in preparation for a war with, guess who, Russia. So Scott, how is it, pardon my sarcasm here, but how is it that NATO is in crisis when you have these new members preparing the way for a war with Russia?
Well, I mean, you can prepare for a war, but can you fight a war? Neither Finland nor Sweden is ready to fight a high-intensity conflict with a peer-level opponent like Russia. They're incapable of sustaining the casualties that will be inflicted on them. And that's right. But the good news is that Russia doesn't want a war with either Finland or Sweden. Russia is looking for making a neutral Ukraine and then putting those draft treaties back on the table and saying, we want a European security framework. The other interesting thing is that part of the underlying concept of this new European security framework is that NATO withdraws its military infrastructure back to its 1997 lines. Well, guess what happens to Finland and Sweden when that happens? All these military bases, all these NATO bases Finland once built on its soil aren't going to exist. Finland will be left alone. The same thing with Sweden. And suddenly they're going to realize that this NATO membership idea was a horrible idea, just an absolute disaster of an idea. And eventually you're going to see them withdraw from NATO. As like I said, I don't see NATO lasting much longer. When Trump has said and JD Vance is his vice president, they both said, we're not married to NATO. We're not going to, whatever NATO becomes, it'll be different than what it is now, because we, the United States, are no longer going to be taking the lead in funding and making this work. If NATO is going to be anything, Europe has to pay for it, and Europe can't pay for it. Again, come up with the Germans. Schultz promised 100 billion euros early on in this conflict in 2022. He said Germany has to rebuild its military. We're going to spend 100 billion euros to build up the German military capability. So Germany is now the heart of NATO. He spent that, but in the last year's budget, 2023 budget or 2024 budget, it was all gone. And they hadn't accomplished any of the things they wanted to accomplish. It was all gone. And yet now the military is saying, well, we have to do this expansion. For instance, one of the projects was to put a German brigade in Lithuania. Right now, Germany has a battalion there that together with sort of this amalgam battalion of other NATO forces that are part of this battle group, NATO battle group, and in the Baltics and in Poland. There's, I think, 4 separate battle groups. And Germany has the Lithuanian lead. Germany is creating a brigade now. They're going to expand this battalion into a brigade, which means they have to create new units. Now, the interesting thing is the German Constitution prohibits German soldiers from being permanently stationed outside of Germany unless the soldiers volunteer for this and say, we want to do that. So they have to recruit soldiers specifically for this new brigade. It doesn't look like they're able to recruit those. We'll see what happens. But right now, it's not looking like they can even recruit the soldiers. But even if they get the soldiers, they need to build, they equip 2 battalions. They have to buy brand new equipment, and they can't make this equipment. Their factories are unable to produce this equipment. So this dream of a German brigade forming up in Lithuania, they can't do it. But moreover, the German defense minister, Pistorius, I believe his name is, he asked for, a certain budget size that was, necessary to keep what the German military had and allow for some growth. What Parliament gave him was a budget that was less than inflation, which means that the German military has to shrink. So instead of expanding, the German military has to shrink. They have to start shedding off additional capabilities. This is the reality of Germany's military budget going forward. They don't have the money because of this collapsed economy to build this gigantic military. And so, the German military, the British, their military is in a huge crisis right now. I've joked about this before, but it's become even more apparent. You could take the totality of the British Army, put them into, Manchester United Stadium, and have 30,000 unsold seats. because the British military, and it's shrinking and shrinking. And the other thing that's happening with the British is that the quality of the manpower going in is subpar. There was a horrible report about the German Navy and what happens on submarines. But that's what happens when you recruit the dregs of society. No normal person wants to join the British military anymore. The call for patriotism just isn't there anymore. And so you have to lower your standards, lower your standards, lower your standards. And what you get is crap. And the British military is crap from head to toe. The equipment is insufficient to the task, doesn't work. They don't have enough manpower. The Brits talk about, we're going to send a brigade. They don't have a brigade to send. That's just the fact. It's the same thing. The French military is going through similar problems. They were talking about sending, 60, 70,000 troops to Ukraine, but they would have to deploy them and push them through a port in Romania into Ukraine. In 2022, 2023, the French military did a major logistics exercise that moved 12,000 men, and they couldn't do it. I mean, it was a strain on them to do it. And that's in a peacetime exercise. How do you now say you're going to take this system that could barely get 12,000 men moved from point A to point B, and suddenly you're going to expand it and make it send 60,000 troops? And where are those 60,000 troops coming from? France doesn't have 60,000 combat-ready troops to go. This is the reality of all of Europe. None of these militaries have combat-capable forces. They look good on paper, but look at the German Air Force. Look at the operational readiness rate of their aircraft. The vast majority of the aircraft are hangar queens that haven't been flown because they don't have spare parts, because they're not properly maintained. So the numbers look good on paper, but in reality, when you start taking a look at what can actually fly, what can actually drive, these numbers are significantly reduced. And so the idea that Europe is going to find 75 to 100,000, European soldiers ready to surge into Ukraine to serve as peacekeepers, which is one of the things that Trump was talking about, is a joke, because they don't exist. There's men on paper, but the resources for a truly expeditionary force, they don't exist. They can't logistically sustain them. They need the United States to help. And Trump is just saying, this is not what we're going to be doing.
Well, Scott, in our remaining time, I'd like to talk about West Asia and the Middle East. My first question, though, we are exiting the year 2024. A lot has happened, of course, in West Asia. I wanted to touch on a development that's been occurring essentially every day since the Christmas holiday, and that is Yemen, Ansarallah, daily strikes into Israel using their Palestine 2 ballistic missiles. Now, reports are that they've been able to strike near, around, or on the Ben Gurion airport, causing a lot of pandemonium inside of Israel. I wanted to ask you, Scott, reports are also suggesting that, the United States and the UK and reportedly Israel are bombing Yemen in retaliation, or supposedly in retaliation to this. And now the reports are that Ansarallah is launching these missiles after they're being bombed. They're launching them from the same sites inside of Yemen from where they were just struck. So, Scott, from a weapons inspector perspective, as well as just how you've been following this development, how is Ansarallah able to do this, and what is its significance given all of the changes that have occurred in West Asia, from Gaza and the broader region this year?
Well, first of all, we won't look at it from a weapons inspector perspective, but a scud hunter perspective, because that's what I did during the Gulf War. I was involved in hunting Iraqi scud missiles. They're mobile missiles that they were firing into Israel and into Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab nations. I would just advise people to look at a map and see how big Yemen is, especially the area controlled by the Houthi. Then superimpose that over Iraq, especially Western Iraq. and you'll understand that, this is a huge swath of land. We, during the Gulf War, diverted somewhere around 2,500 sorties of our best aircraft, the F-15Es, et cetera, to go on a scud hunt. We sent special operations forces, the British SAS, the American Delta Force. We deployed them into Western Iraq, trying to hunt these guys down. We flew the helicopters from the Night Stalkers, the 160th Special Operations Airborne Regiment. And you know how many Scuds we killed in that entire effort? The answer is 0. We didn't kill any. Because taking down mobile missiles is very, very difficult. Ansarallah has been, when the Iraqis started the Gulf War, they, their first operational experience flying against a Western-style enemy was on January 17th when the war started. Ansarallah has been fighting a Western-style enemy since 2014, when Saudi Arabia began its conflict. And Saudi Arabia has an air force that consists of Western aircraft, mainly American aircraft, incorporating American intelligence to drop American bombs on Yemeni targets. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the Yemenis have been the Houthi have been at this for a long time. They know how to fight. They know how to they know how to survive. Their missile forces have been dodging modern aircraft targeted by modern intelligence collection systems for over a decade now. And so the hubris of the United States that we're going to come in together with Israel and we're going to solve this problem because we're taking the same airplanes, but this time they have an Israeli pilot or an American pilot, but they're still targeted by the same intelligence system, and suddenly we're going to be more efficient at this. First of all, the Israelis aren't involved in the interdiction of mobile relocatable targets. That's not the Israelis are just out to punish. This is why they're bombing, oil infrastructure. That's why they're bombing energy, power plants and things of that nature. They're not involved in this futile effort of trying to take out, the Yemeni missile force, this Palestine 2 hypersonic missile, which should tell you everything. You guys do know the United States doesn't have an operational hypersonic missile yet because they're hard to build. They're tough. The Dark Eagle, which is supposed to be our ground launch version of it, was supposed to be ready for deployment this year, late last year, early in 2024. It's not ready yet. Why? Because it's not easy to do this. The problem is just the way we procure weapons and we try and make it do everything, and it's a perfect weapon, too complicated. The Yemeni have built a hypersonic missile. And so anybody makes fun of them, I don't know. Everybody's probably seen the same video of the Yemeni soldier who ran out there, picked up his wounded comrade, threw him over his arm, and then ran across the desert. And that's a significant hike that he went on, running under fire from the Saudis, didn't flinch and just kept going. And he made it. And you're like, okay, that's Medal of Honor kind of stuff. But for the Yemeni, it's just like, no, that's what we do. That's what we do. But, they wear sandals and they have these curved knives and they wear dish dash. And, there's a tendency to say, they're not very sophisticated. Ladies and gentlemen, they built a hypersonic missile when the United States hasn't successfully built one yet. And they're employing it in combat, and they're defeating the best anti-missile defense shield the world has ever seen. The idea that we're going to come in there and interdict this kind of stuff, they're very good at hiding these missiles. They've been doing this for a long time. One of the things that we learned after the war is what the Iraqis were doing with Scud decoys. I remember being shown a videotape that was taken by Black Hawk, you call them DAPs, defensive arm penetrators. But this is Special Forces helicopters. Delta Force was in Western Iraq hunting down these Scuds, and the Blackhawks were out patrolling, looking, and they came upon this Scud missile launcher with a Scud missile on it. So they fired it up. I remember I was called in to review it, and I got them mad when I looked at it. I said, "That's not a Scud missile." I said, "Look, the gaps are wrong here, da da da." But this is a very good decoy, a very good decoy. And the Iraqis were using these decoys to, to shape the battlefield. I imagine that the Yemenis have learned from that, and that a lot of things that we're bombing that we think are Yemeni missiles aren't. They're decoys. It's deception. I think the Yemeni have become very good. They've had 10 years to perfect this, and they prove it every day. We sit there and say we're bombing this, we're blowing up this, we're blowing up that, and yet every day they fire one or two more Palestine 2 hypersonic missiles into Israel that the Israelis can't shoot down. And I mean, it's an amazing feat. It's not going to destroy Israel, but what it does is it destroys the image of Israel that Israel's trying to. Plus, it's a hell of a shot in the arm for the Palestinians, who knows at least there's one nation out there that continues to fight on their behalf, and that's the Houthi. And while they're doing those missiles, they're still hitting ships. Again, remember, we were supposed to have stopped them from doing that too. We've sent in the United States Navy, and we're not stopping anything. These guys, they know how to fight, and they want to fight. They believe in this fight, and it's almost impossible to defeat them.
Yeah, and we've seen, Scott, this year of 2024, it ended quite difficult with the fall of Syria. But this year has been an intense, very dynamic situation where, of course, you have the tragic genocide in Gaza, which is just a horrific crime against humanity committed by Israel and its backers in the United States and the West. But in that, we did see incredibly fierce resistance, Hezbollah to the south of its border. We had Iran and Israel exchange strikes for in maybe the most significant way in history between the two countries. And now we're at a point where a lot of people are feeling very discouraged by the situation. And so Yemen's continued stand is really interesting to me, because as this has been going on, both the U.S. and Israeli side have said this is an adversary that they've never seen before, they're claiming, but they're also saying that in saying that, they're saying that they can't defeat this force. And that makes me wonder, Scott, Israel is looking very good right now. It's able to expand into Syria. Hezbollah can't necessarily fight back at the moment. But at the same time, it appears that there's always going to be now from here on out a conflict. Israel, there will really no peace anymore. There won't be social peace for Israel's project. And this genocide is nowhere near its end. Where do you see all of this going in 2025?
Prior to the collapse of Syria, prior to the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, it looked as if the cause of Palestine was gaining the upper hand. Israel never fully recovered from the embarrassment of October 7th. Israel has shown that it can commit genocide against the civilians of Gaza, but it wasn't able to defeat Hamas. Even when they, took out Sinwar, they turned him into a martyr, into a hero. The way he died fighting, he wasn't hiding in a tunnel. He was above ground fighting, and his last act of defiance was something that, served to motivate the continuation of Hamas's armed resistance. The Israelis had said that the victory against Hamas would be defined by the defeat of Hamas as a military organization and the elimination of Hamas as a political entity. And they had failed on both fronts. It was a very strategic failure for Israel. With Hezbollah, the goal of Hassan Nasrallah was always managed escalation, not looking to turn this into an outright war between Israel and Hezbollah. And one of the reasons why is that they knew that Israel would turn it into a war between Israel and Lebanon, and that would create political problems for Hezbollah because they are a political party of the Lebanese government, and they have to be responsive to the Lebanese government. And at some point in time, the Lebanese government would say, we're not going to let Beirut turn into another Gaza. And so their goal was to avoid that. But eventually Netanyahu ran out of options with Hamas. Was looking at, already had received, a missile attack from the, two missile attacks from the Iranians, and began a full-scale war with Hezbollah. And again, the Israelis said our goal is to physically destroy Hezbollah. They weren't able to do that. In fact, the resilience of the Hezbollah defenders in southern Lebanon got the Israeli military to turn to Netanyahu and say, we have to have a ceasefire. We can't continue to do this. And the Israelis benefit from the fact that the West was able to put pressure on the Lebanese government to go to Hezbollah and say, we need a ceasefire. What made that even more easy is because the Israelis killed Hassan Nasrallah and a large number of the Hezbollah leadership, and the remaining leadership didn't have the charisma or the credibility of a Hassan Nasrallah. And when confronted by the Lebanese government, which they are a part of, that there was a need for the ceasefire, they agreed to it. So a lot of people viewed that as a setback, but I didn't, because I didn't believe the Israelis were going to be able to abide by the ceasefire. Netanyahu's political survival couldn't last with, that we were looking at the last days of Netanyahu's government. And then this miracle happens from the Israeli perspective, the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Nobody saw it coming, this black swan event. And overnight, Netanyahu, who was on literally, Seymour Hersh wrote a brilliant Substack article back in November that talked about the reality of the difficulties faced by Netanyahu, and his government was going to collapse, and that was the end of him. He had nothing to fall back on. Suddenly, overnight, he'd always been saying, "I'm the guy. The reason why you have to keep me in is I'm the guy that can secure Israel. I'm the guy that can defeat the Iranians, defeat Hezbollah, defeat Hamas, make Israel safe again." And his credibility was shot. Suddenly, Assad collapsed, and the situation for Hezbollah changed overnight. The landline that between Iran, through Syria to Lebanon was now broken, and Hezbollah's ability to rearm, to sustain this kind of conflict was no longer there. Plus, now the Lebanese leadership is now isolated. The Iranians looked at this situation and said, in order to restore this, we'd have to go to full-scale war, and we're not ready to do this. We're not willing to do this. We're not willing to do that to prop up Syria, and we're damn sure not willing to do it to expand this war to reestablish a land bridge with Hezbollah. And the Iranians have now taken a strategic approach of pulling back and reaching out to the West. If the statements of the Turkish foreign minister are true, he was told by the Iranians to relay to the West that Iran is not looking for a war with Israel, that Iran wants to avoid that altogether, and that what Iran would like to do is have negotiation with the West on how to resolve this situation, which now puts Trump back into a situation where he could fulfill his own promise when he withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. I think he withdrew from it. He didn't withdraw from it because he was trying to overthrow Iran. He said, I think it's a horrible deal. I want to negotiate a better deal. And right now, I think the Iranians are willing to sit down with Trump and negotiate or try to negotiate a better deal. This is, look what just happened. Hezbollah has been neutered. Iran has been pushed to the side. Assad has fallen. Israeli forces now are advancing inside Syria. Hamas no longer has the benefit of the axis of resistance, except for the Houthi, who are, it's symbolic. I mean, you know, 1 or 2 missiles a day isn't going to break Israel, but it's symbolic. But the bottom line is Hamas now is in a very, very difficult position, unsustainable position, because the Israelis aren't bogged down in Hezbollah, you know, in Lebanon. They're able to divert. So literally within a span of a week, Netanyahu's political fortunes have shifted. He is what he said he was always wanting to be. He is the savior of greater Israel. And this is where Israel stands today. Now, the reality is there's still a lot of domestic problems for Benjamin Netanyahu. That hasn't gone away. But he has pulled his neck out of the noose that he himself had woven that was going to hang him. And he is now in a very superior position at a time when a president is coming in who is building an administration whose sole function appears to be to prop up Israel, defend Israel. And I think we're going to see in the coming year Israel reestablishing itself as a regional power. Everything that was accomplished from October 7th until the ceasefire with Hezbollah will be undone. The Palestinian cause may live in the hearts of people, but there's no chance now for a Palestinian state to emerge. Israel isn't going to allow it. The conditions aren't going to happen to cause the collapse of Israel that would facilitate that. What you're going to see, I believe, in the coming year is the depopulation of Gaza as the world tires of this conflict. And you're going to see Israel basically stifling the West Bank, expansion of settlements, etc., so that there's no chance whatsoever for a Palestinian state to be created. And the world's going to accept this because Donald Trump is going to ensure that they accept this. Look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia on October 6th, 2023, was preparing to normalize relations with Israel and create the conditions for the implementation of this visionary India, Middle East, European economic corridor that I have mocked over and over again, and said it wasn't viable after October 7th. That it just isn't going to happen. Well, I can't say that anymore. We have a change in circumstances, and I am confident that the United States will put pressure on Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia will reverse course, and they'll sell the Palestinians out as they always do. The Gulf Arab states always sell out Palestine. Egypt always sells out Palestine. Jordan always sells out Palestine. The nation that never sold them out, Syria, they're gone. Lebanon, Hezbollah, they're neutered. They're neutralized. Iran seeking peace. It's even the Iraqi Shia militias are saying that they're going to stop their attacks on Israel. That's under orders from Iran. The Houthi, on the other hand, they're going to keep firing Palestine 2 missiles as long as they can. But the thing is, I think Israel is going to be in a very dominant position for years to come. And it's just the way it is, because there's nobody outside of Hamas and the Houthi that are willing to confront them militarily.
Yeah, we're seeing that. We're seeing Al-Qassam and the various forces within the resistance, the Palestinian resistance, continue to do what they do in Jabalia and other areas of the absolutely besieged and devastated Gaza Strip. We're seeing resistance in the West Bank, and of course we're seeing Ansar Allah. But there is this, what seems to me though, Scott, is maybe final comment on this before we move on to the all of this. Well, it does seem very much a pessimistic outlook based in reality right now, it does seem to me that this big break for Israel could also ignite a powder keg in and of itself, because not only is Syria now the location of what seems to me guaranteed chaos, but also when colonial entities like Israel get big breaks, they do really horrific things, as we have seen with Gaza, which means that perhaps this future that will be very painful also leaves what seems to be a potentially explosive situation in 2025 to come, which maybe will bring some surprises. Because I'm curious also to your response to the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, when he says that there are no proxies for Iran and that a lot of these forces have their own domestic production of weapons. I'm curious on how you see that comment in light of this very explosive situation to come, which will indeed ignite the conditions, the suffering and the pain for resistance that led to this first iteration before the fall of Syria, or at least the initial iteration in response to the Gaza genocide.
Well, I mean, who am I to contradict Ali Khamenei? But it makes sense. I mean, if you take a look at the size of some of these weapons that Hezbollah possesses, that Yemen is using, and you keep in mind, Israel's been trying to interdict them, the ongoing bombing of Syria, etc. What you realize is that there is a combination of indigenous production. That is, Hezbollah has its missile factories, Yemen has its missile factories, but that and I think the project was is called Operation Precision Guidance, or something of that nature. But the Iranians would provide kits of guidance equipment and specialized equipment that would be brought in to turn, a basic system into a precision guided weapon. And I think the same thing is with the Houthi. So I think Ali Khamenei is not lying, but he's not telling the whole truth. And the other thing is that we don't know of right now. It's coming out that Israel had been very successful at infiltrating Hezbollah, and I mean, it was obvious the way that they took out Hassan Nasrallah, precision intelligence, the way they took out leadership. There's something going on inside the Hezbollah structure that was tipping off the Israelis to where these people were. And there were some very big explosions, when Israel was striking Hezbollah targets north of the Litani River, not the tactical targets, but the strategic targets that implied that they were hitting, high value targets. They were taking out maybe the factories that were used. So I think Hezbollah suffered, and I think that's one of the reasons why Hezbollah was compelled to accept this ceasefire, was that they had taken some hits. Their guys on the front lines were fighting like cats and dogs. Just ask the Golani Brigade, ask Agos, the elite, commando force that lost a lot of guys there. Ask the 7th Armor Brigade that were brought in like the cavalry, rushed a village and left broken and bloodied. The Hezbollah fighters weren't giving up an inch, but strategically, Hezbollah had taken a hit leadership-wise, and I believe in some of their infrastructure, especially maybe their military production capabilities. One of the things that helps the Houthi is that the Israelis have not been able to penetrate them anywhere near the success they had with Hezbollah, and so everybody's flying blind when it comes to where things are located, what's going on, etc. But with Hezbollah, it appears that the Israelis had successfully infiltrated the Hezbollah hierarchy and had some very good intelligence on how they were taking that out. So Hezbollah is, I think Ali Khamenei is trying to put a good face on what is a strategic setback for Iran. I don't think Hezbollah is going to be able to rearm to the level. And the other thing we have to realize is that there's a whole new political reality that's existing inside Lebanon today. We're seeing the Christians speak out more forcefully. New president asserting with Syria collapsed. We're seeing. I think you're going to see investment opportunities. Iran, provided a lot of the sustainment to the Lebanese government. Iranian oil that was brought in through Syria, etc. That's gone. And so I think you're going to see a Lebanon that recognizes in order to survive, they have to change the Hezbollah equation. And I think Hezbollah, because they don't have a Hassan Nasrallah anymore, the people they have don't have the same clout, the same gravitas, the same credibility. And I think, Hezbollah is a political party that wants to continue to be a successful political party. And I think that you're going to start to see a separation of the political party from the Hezbollah as a militia. And under Security Council resolution, the Hezbollah militia is supposed to turn itself over to the Lebanese armed forces. And I think you're going to see a gradual push in that direction that'll be facilitated by the fact that Hezbollah as a political movement has to get involved in the governance of Lebanon. It cannot sit there and try and pick a fight with Israel when they don't have the support of Syria or Iran anymore, the kind of support that they once had. And you have a Lebanese government which was sympathetic to Hezbollah early on, now saying we're done with this war, we're into the rebuilding phase. So I think we're looking at checkmate on Hezbollah. I'd love to be proven wrong, but that's just my take. Hamas, I don't know how much longer they can continue doing what they do. I don't know how much longer the Gazan civilians. What I will say is this: before the fighting in Lebanon, before the collapse of Syria, the deaths of the Gazan civilians was resonating globally, and you were seeing a meaningful impact by this ongoing genocide, action in the International Court of Justice, action in the International Criminal Court, nations like Spain and others recognizing the Palestinian state, even the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, coming out and making a statement that Saudi Arabia will never normalize relations with Israel until which time there's a free and independent Palestinian state whose capital is in East Jerusalem. This all was happening because of the horrible genocide that Israel was waging against the Palestinians in Gaza. But now it's still happening. I mean, they just bombed. They just took over a hospital. They've arrested nurses and doctors, and they bomb tents, and children get their faces blown off and their bodies dismembered, and it's all happening still. No one's talking about it right now because the world's lost focus. That was the whole genius of what Hassan Nasrallah was trying to do with this escalation, this controlled escalation, was to ensure that the focus remained on Hamas and on Gaza and on Palestine, not to allow it to divert. Right now, everybody's talking about Syria, and Palestine's a sideshow. And I just think the Israelis are just going to continue to do what they do. No one's talking about it. It's not creating international scandal because we're all worried about Syria and Iran and things of that nature, the Houthi. No one's talking about Gaza right now. And I think what's going to happen is that the situation is going to become so horrible for the Gazans that, and because they have no hope now that the axis of resistance is collapsed, I think you're going to see the depopulation of Gaza. and the end of Gaza, and what that means, the end of Hamas.
Yeah. Well, in the interest of time, Scott, I did want to ask you about, I don't know if you saw the imagery of China's reportedly sixth generation fighter jets and the amphibious assault ship, which is, according to reports, the biggest in history. And maybe I would ask you to comment on this in light of how BRICS has developed over the past year. Any comments you have on the growth of BRICS? There was a summit in Kazan and in October 2024. And of course, that train keeps on moving despite all of the incredible attempts by the United States and the rest of its allies, so-called, and Israel, of course, to arrest this development. So any comments you have on this, and then maybe an audience question or two, and we can head out.
Sure. Well, first of all, BRICS was one of the major events of last year. It's interesting. In the lead up to BRICS, myself and others were talking about how important BRICS is and how it's going to be, a transformational event, especially the Kazan. But it always had to be couched in terms of, the big picture. I think people have short attention spans and they're used to things happening very quickly on the internet. BRICS isn't one of those things that's going to be, happening very quickly. We've seen, between the Chinese, the South Africans, and the Russians over the course of the last 3 years, we've seen BRICS turn from a club into this formal global institution that has, a framework of institutions, that facilitate meetings and dialogue, et cetera. This is the success of Russia. And this is what they built in Kazan, something that an edifice that will last, that has staying power. But, people who were waiting for BRICS to come up with a currency. Why didn't BRICS put out the BRICS currency and challenge the dollar? Well, they're not ready. You got to build the institution. You got to build consensus. They aren't ready for that right now. Why didn't BRICS, take over the global economy? Because they're not ready for that. That's not their job. But what BRICS did just happened, I think, today or yesterday. Thailand, Russia has announced that Thailand's going to be the next member of BRICS. That happens in January. Thailand, that's an American ally. Thailand is now going to be a member of BRICS. Why is that important? Well, BRICS is seen as a challenge to a lot of these forums that comprise what's called the rules-based international order that the United States promotes as, what has to continue to exist to keep the world doing what America wants it to do, which is basically revolve around the American singularity and promote American hegemony. Thailand's a member of ASEAN. As soon as you start stripping Thailand, Malaysia will follow. Singapore will follow. That's the end of ASEAN as a major, forum for, economic and social and geopolitical discussion. The United States views ASEAN as its playground. It's gone. It's, this is the beginning, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's just this part of this gradual, never-ending expansion. This is going to unfold over the course of years, and it can't be stopped. And that's the importance of BRICS. A movement has begun that will supplant the rules-based international order, which was the vision that Putin and Xi Jinping had when they met on February 4th, 2022, on the eve of the special military operation during the Beijing Winter Olympics, 5,000-word manifesto. So BRICS is a big deal, but it's lacking the drama that I think sometimes is needed for the average audience member to pay attention to. If you follow BRICS, it's boring, but that's okay They don't care, because that's how you that's how you win all this, is just to build this institution. It's going to challenge, you're going to attract more people. And next thing you know, it will be the shot caller in the global economy, and not the G7, not the G20. It'll be BRICS. And that's the direction. So it's I think it's one of the fundamentally most important events that has occurred in many, many decades.
Yeah, and when we put BRICS in the rise of this new development model, a multipolar world, into the context of what we've been talking about so far, Scott, it makes a lot of sense then that even, there are a lot of people who are angry at Iran for potentially uh, uh, taking a pause in, let's say, launching Operation True Promise 3, for example. But at the same time, a lot of what multipolarity is trying to develop something new and different and better than the world that exists now without, and you mentioned this a bit in your commentary on Russia not overreacting around the attackums, for example, is if Iran, if Russia, if China just unleash these weapons, which look mighty impressive, but they are going to be mighty impressive for defensive purposes. They're not going to just go send them off and try to conduct some kind of air war or a naval war in the South China Sea offensively. And all of this is to say is that I think what we see is that, yes, there are incredible sacrifices and difficult choices that are made, but the point of it is to not get into the all-out war situation, which will be the destruction of everybody. You've warned it is the destruction of everybody if Russia and the United States, Russia and NATO get into a direct shooting war, because we're talking about nuclear powers. But the same can be said about any one of these conflicts that involve any one of the bigger powers of this new multipolar world, Russia, China, and now Iran, which is making huge headway in building these big strategic partnerships with these countries. And that in and of itself has to be preserved to an extent, because, and I look at what happened to Syria, Scott, with the sanctions. Now Sergei Lavrov is talking about sanctions being a reason why Syria fell, and it's 100% a big factor. I think some people are just ignoring how 90%, a starving population, and upwards of 90%, is going to have a difficult time, standing with their government when something bad happens. That's just going to be the case. People are going to be thinking about how are they going to eat. And Iran has sanctions upon it. So Iran is under economic war. Iran can't afford to both fight an all-out military campaign and develop the multipolar world in the region and beyond. Those two things are very difficult to do at the same time. So that's my one commentary. If you have any final thoughts on that, Scott, and I can bring up a question or two here, because some folks
Yeah, I'll say, first of all, I agree totally about Iran's prior. The other thing when we talk about BRICS and Iran, the BRICS, membership drive was the pet project of Raisi. This was his baby, and this was the strategic direction that he wanted to take, and he viewed it as sort of the break from the West and the pivot to the East. This decisive, strategic redirection, and it was predicated on the concept that Iran's economy was just ravaged, and the Iranian people were paying a heavy price. And if you go and take a look at what Lavrov is saying, that sort of was the building block of what brought down Bashar al-Assad, fighting this very lengthy, bloody war with the Syrian rebels and the foreign fighters, etc., which Syria won together, with Russia and Iranian help. But that Assad wasn't able to make the transition to solve the underlying problems of society. society. And that's a lesson that the Iranians, I think, are looking at. The Iranians, I think, understand the importance of having the society back this up. A lot of people aren't aware of the fact that in August, September of 2023, there was a huge fight inside of Iran waged between the Iranian government and separatist organizations supported by the intelligence services of a number of nations, and who are all acting in concert in the aftermath of the tragic death of the Kurdish girl who got detained because of a hijab violation and died in police custody. What started out as demonstrations in the street quickly got hijacked by these groups that were funded and directed by the intelligence services of nations hostile to Iran. And Raisi spoke at the United Nations to a group of people, and he said this was one of the most dangerous periods in Iranian history. That Iran was at real threat here. This fighting was real. It threatened Iran. Could have brought about a collapse of the Iranian government. But that because of the strength of the Iranian people in backing the Iranian government, they were able to overcome, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the lesson there was that you've got to give something back to the Iranian people. If they're going to sit there and fight for you and say, okay, we're choosing not to support the monarchists, we're choosing not to support MBK, we're choosing not to support Kurdish independence, the Afghans, Arab independence, the Baluch. We're not going to do that. We're going to support Iran. But we're doing so because we believe you when you say that you're going to look out for our best interests. And the Iranian government has to deliver. Raisi never intended for there to be a war with Israel. It wasn't on the books. The Hamas attack on October 7th took him by surprise. And they adjusted. They worked with Hassan Nasrallah to come up with this, managed escalation concept. But the goal was never to have a full-scale war. And when Raisi died, he died after True Promise 1 occurred, but before True Promise 2. The new president came in, and his whole campaign was about improving relations with the West to halt the strategic pivot that Raisi had made, and to say, well, wait a minute, we'll continue to do this BRICS thing, but we're also going to start looking to the West. And it was interesting because that occurred in the June-July period where the some major decisions were being made about what's going to happen with BRICS, and Iran had to form a new government and then send people to work with the Russians and all this. And the Russians and the Iranians have been working very carefully together with the Chinese to talk about the direction that Iran needs to go. True Promise 2 was done maybe with the not the full support of the Iranian president, who believes that some opportunities were lost in terms of negotiation with the European Union because of True Promise 2. And True Promise 3 is something that he was just dead set against. He's not looking for a war. He's looking for making life better. And it's important that he does, because in 2023, the Iranian people rallied behind the government. But what's to say that's going to be the case in 2025, 2026? Especially if the government makes the same mistake Bashar al-Assad makes, which is to focus on conflict and not focus on making it better. Sanctions undermine the Syrian regime. It's in Iran's best interest to get sanctions lifted. And right now, I think the new president believes that the sanctions can best be lifted by negotiating with the West on some agreeable framework for the lifting of sanctions. So I think that's the direction they're going. So it's a whole new direction. And it's designed to save Iran. And we have to respect that fact that Iran isn't here to appease whatever policy objectives we have. Iran exists for Iran, and they have to have a viable economy that is feeding the needs of the Iranian people, who have been starved by sanctions since the 1980s. So it's sometimes we lose sight of that. We get so caught up in our own thing, free Palestine, do this, the resistance, da da da. We forget that the Iranian people have been suffering under sanctions for decades now, and they've always hung on with the hope that decisions we made, this pivot to BRICS was supposed to be that opportunity. But now we've got a new complication because the president appears to want to have negotiations with the West. The interesting thing is people say, well, where is Ali Khamenei in all this? Remember, this new president wouldn't be president if Ali Khamenei didn't want him to be president. They could have shut him down with the Guardian Council, who just could have said, nah, he doesn't meet the ideological purity test. He's eliminated. They did that to Larjani, who was a very powerful former speaker. They did that to a couple other people who Ahmadinejad, a former president, was trying to run for the Guardian Council, said no. So they kept him in the race because the powers that be understood that there's a need for a political outlet for the moderate voices of the Iranian people. And, the question was, how politically empowered is this moderate voice? And the test is put your moderate candidate up for a vote and see what happens. And he beat Jalili, I believe it was, the former nuclear negotiator, very conservative guy. And so the Iranian theocracy has to respect this. Yes, you can't go out and do things precipitously. Yes, things have to be considered. But for people who are sitting there going, well, this new president, he's doing things that are totally against Iran. No, he's not, actually. He's president because people in the inner circle said there's a need for a moderate president. And now they have to respect the fact that he's trying to implement policies that are designed to preserve Iran. And anyways, that's where that is.
Well, we had a lot of good questions from the audience, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to be able to select one. And a lot of them are asking you for pretty big answers, Scott. These are really big questions. But Scott, if you could, just in the interest of time, I think we're all getting tired. Here's one. It's a scenario. A nation will step up and deploy troops confronting Israel in the West. Trump will pull out because of his image, and a bloody battle will ensue. Someone has to stop Israel, and it will happen. Israel cannot exist. Thoughts, Scott?
But what nation will step up? Yemen, the Houthi? They don't have the ability to project power meaningfully into Israel. I mean, there's this huge landmass called Saudi Arabia that separates them. What nation is going to say Turkey? Turkey has no interest in confronting Israel. Turkey is going to do what's in Turkey's interests. So who's going to step up? Egypt? No, Egypt's not going to step up. Jordan? Come on. I'm not being facetious, but no one's going to step up and challenge Israel. The greatest threat that Israel faces today is Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu just went through, prostate cancer surgery, stage 3. Well, we don't know how it's going to go, but he's not long for this world. I mean, he's going to die eventually. And when that happens, you're going to be looking at a political crisis inside Israel as the far right wrestles up against the moderate center to figure out who's going to govern and what policies they're going to implement. The role of the United States at that time, I believe, is going to be to put a protective shield over Israel to protect it from potential foreign policy disputes while Israel fixes itself domestically. But I don't see a nation stepping up and challenging Israel. I just don't see it.
Yes. Well, with all that said, everyone, first, I just want to say many thanks to you, Scott, for a big year. We collaborated quite a bit this year, very closely, and I believe that it was very important, and it has done a lot of good, both in this space and outside of it, out in YouTube and streaming and independent media, and also outside of it. And so I really appreciate all of your contributions here and everything that you do for the cause of peace. So I just wanted to say that, and also to the great audience for this year has been an incredible year of growth and a real, I think, demonstration that there's a thirst for knowledge, as you always talk about, Scott, a thirst to empower ourselves with knowledge around these critical developments occurring around the world, which are truly shaping the future of humanity as we know it. So these are questions that are so big and so important, and we are just doing our small part in trying to impart knowledge around them. And so deep gratitude to the audience, definitely, for continuing to show up and show out, even on a December 30th before New Year's Eve, when most people are ready to celebrate, maybe get trashed and do whatever you do to celebrate this. But any final words that you want to say, Scott, before we head out of here? Because it has been a long one and it is getting late.
Well, I want to thank you for being a great partner this year and doing this. You know, we whatever term you want to put on it, I call it the family of podcasts. There's there's this core group of podcasters who we tend to share similar interview base, but we come at the problems from different perspectives. But at the end of the day, we're helping each other out, and we have achieved an impact through alternative media that surpasses that of many of the mainstream media outlets. We were talking about, the viewership we get that we were building through this family of podcasts this fall. We beat CNN, we beat MSNBC. And this is important, and it's because of work that you do and others do, and the collaboration that we have, which went beyond podcast. We put together that panel discussion in New York City, and so one of the reasons why we're so active in 2024 is that 2024 was a very active year. Well, Danny, I hate to tell you, I'm pretty sure that 2025 is going to be a very active year.
Yeah.
And that we're going to have to continue doing what we've been doing and maybe even expanding that work. And
Totally.
It's important. And, we do it because we believe in this. It's a mission, but we can't do it without the help of our respective audiences. And I would just say on behalf of Danny that whatever you guys can do to support his channel and support his work, please do it because it's important. And next year, we're like the Germans in their defense budget. If you want us to do more, we got to have more money to do this. So if you want Danny and I and others to be able to expand the scope and scale of what we do next year to meet the challenges that are going to be coming forward, then you need to support. So I would just ask everybody, if you're coming into the new year, support Danny Dhaiphong. You're here today, you're listening, you're seeing a product that is only happening because Danny Dhaiphong made it happen. And it's a worthwhile product. All of his efforts are worthwhile, and support him. Send him the best New Year's gift you can send him.
Appreciate that. Please do the same for Scott. His website is in the video description below, scottritter.com. That's where you can support all of his work. The video description is where you can find all the places to support both of us, both his website as well as all the various platforms where you can become members, Patreon, Substack, and so many others. With all that said, everybody, I will be back likely this coming weekend for a Saturday and Sunday live stream. So be staying tuned for that. Thanks so much for all of you coming. Do hit the like button before you go. That helps keep the stream running, even in this late hour here in the U.S. But with all that said, everybody, take care and good night.
And Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Happy last full day of 2024. 2025 will be busy. You are indeed correct, and we'll be here. All right. Take care, everyone.